Iran's long and rich history, dating back thousands of years, is couched in power dynamics. Numerous empires, at least 5 to include what many consider the first world empire, the Achaemenid/Persian, rose and fell. Further, Iran, at the crossroads of Eurasia, also fell under the influence of both Western and Eastern powers a handful of times, such as during the Arabian expansion, Turkic migrations, or Mongol conquests. However, for our purposes in this short lesson, we're looking at Iran as an example of what soft neocolonialism looked like at the turn of the 20th century, as well as inferring how neocolonial practices create feelings of resentment and foment cultures of resistance that last well beyond their applicable eras. To set the stage, we'll begin by mentioning the Qajar Dynasty. This Turkic ruling class controlled parts of the region loosely from their capital, Tehran, between 1796 and 1925. This period, of course, coincides with the peak of exploitative European imperialism on a global level. The Qajar Shahs, or kings, consistently poor practices of offering European colonial powers economic concessions in the country to replenish their treasury made Iran subservient to mercantilist cycles. In this extroverted capitalism, Iran's raw materials and labor were exploited by foreigners, while most profits ended up in Europe, some in the royal treasury, and very little was left for the people. The true primary colonial powers that came to dominate Iran's economy and political apparatus in the late 19th century were Tsarist Russia and England. While Russia's concerns were mostly territorial and to an extent political, England, as usual, sought wealth. Qajar ruler Nasser al-Din Shah, who ruled between 1846 and 1896, dealt with the British and shows how the concessions worked. A key example took place in 1890 when he granted a monopoly on the cultivation and sale of tobacco to one British citizen, G.F. Talbot, for a mere £15,000 and 25% of their profit for the throne. Previewing future resistance, however, this concession didn't last. Iran's religious leaders, known as mushtahids, from their seat in the city of Qom, issued a fatwa against tobacco cultivation, consumption, and use. This further emboldened civil society to protest, and the tobacco riots broke out, forcing the king to rescind the concession. The era of foreign concessions also introduced Iran to certain Western liberal ideals, often taken advantage of by either outsiders or the native higher classes willing to work with the colonizers, that fostered socioeconomic problems previously overlooked in many parts of that region. Emphasis on the value of materialism or the privatization of land and property assaulted traditional values of working for community, the Ummah, and or placing nothing above one's relationship with creation. While it's not as if Iran was some egalitarian oasis prior to this, there was some quite alien, myopic, and callous about the inequality promoted in Western systems of stratification. In 1901, Nasser al-Din's successor, Mozaffar, granted the DRC concession. In short, all rights for oil exploration, exploitation, refinement, and sale were given up for 60 years in almost 3/4 of the country for a merely £40,000 and a 16% annual return on profit, though the English get to keep the records, which is of course ripe for manipulation. Just as the highly industrial 20th century was getting underway, and arguably the most profitable resource was essentially just given away to foreigners by a short-sighted autocrat. For a proud people with a desire to return to at least some autonomy, if not their former glory, this concession was too much. Mozaffar's accommodation policies towards the British continued, which funded his extravagance. In fact, even the colonial powers' subsidies weren't enough to maintain his lavish lifestyle. The ruling class enacted tariffs to pay off the king's debts to Russia. He took out these loans to pay for a royal tour to showcase his wealth. Protests broke out nearly immediately. They would be the onset of the first 20th century rebellion in Iran, the Constitutional Revolution, which lasted between 1905 and 1911. As protesters marched, merchants shut down bazaars. This may not seem like much, but the bazaars acted not only as places to buy and sell things, but the backbone of the economic, local political, and social life. To provide some context, it would be like Wall Street or the Tokyo Stock Exchange shutting down in the United States or Japan today. Without the bazaars, the economy ground to a halt. Islamic scholars and leaders went beyond issuing fatwas. They went on strike in Qom and elsewhere. Many Iranians were deeply religious, and the ruling class at least pretended they were too. This measured response challenged the assumed God-given legitimacy of the Qajar dynasty and foreign actors, further indicating that the Qajars and foreigners cared little for Iranian spirituality. Protesters that sought refuge in mosques were attacked in them. To the pious, this was clearly desecration of holy places, beliefs, and traditions. In the capital, Tehran, Russian and Persian Cossacks killed 22 protesters and injured 100 more. Since the Russians were more violent towards the protests, protesters opted to camp out in the garden of the British Embassy in 1906. This yielded open-air discussions on constitutionalism that led to the people's demand for a Majlis, or a parliament. The king acquiesced to this demand, thinking it would calm the situation. The Majlis opened in October of 1906, and under the rule of law and the crown became a divine gift given to the Shah by the people. Mirza Nasrullah Khan became the first prime minister of Iran. Members of the new Majlis quickly set to take down European concessions, establish representative legislation, secular judicial code, and a free press. Also, Muzaffar died shortly after, and the power vacuum enhanced by controversial legislation taking place in the Majlis gave the Cossacks an excuse to squash this people's attempt at representative republic and reassert the autocratic power of another king, Muhammad Ali Shah. Behind the scenes, it must be noted that England and Russia also divided the country in 1907 at the Anglo-Russian Convention without telling the Iranians. Constitutionalists in Iran, however, fought back. Protests gave way to the militant occupation of major cities. The fiercest fighting took place in 1909 in Tabriz. An interesting side story to the Tabriz narrative was that of Howard Baskerville from North Platte, Nebraska, of all places. Arriving in Iran as a missionary and teacher, he fell in love with the people. He volunteered in a militia to fight off the royalists and the Russians. He died leading a frontline charge and remains a martyr of revolution to this day in Iran. Other foreign actors defending Tabriz include the Armenian hero Nicole Duman. The Majlis reconvened in 1909 and hired another USer, William Morgan Schuster, to revive the economy by helping them implement a modern taxation system. This system meant to replace the old corrupt zamindari practices. To help fund other modernization projects, Schuster also advised the seizure of Russian imperial assets. He firmly believed in an independent, autonomous, and representative Iran, and the Majlis respected him a great deal. Russia called for his dismissal, and upon refusal, invaded Iran. They even shelled the parliamentary buildings with artillery. Schuster left Iran in regret. He wrote in the book, The Strangling of Persia, and I quote, "Time with whose passage certain pains abate, but sharpens those of Persia's unjust fate." The great hero, Muhammad Vali Khan, better known as Sepahadar Azam, was also able to lead resistance forces into the capital and even hold it. The Russians negotiated an uneasy relationship of shared power with Azam. He became prime minister 4 times. However, World War I and the ensuing Bolshevik Revolution brought a new regime to power in Moscow. After securing victory over the White Army in the Russian Civil War, the new Soviet leadership took a different stance on colonial and imperial enterprises. In Marxist terms, these practices undermined the idea of a global proletariat, and more or less left Britain as the sole real colonial power in Iran, though they would intervene intermittently. During and after World War I transition, a Persian Cossack garnered the attention of colonial powers. Reza Khan was eventually promoted by the British to retake Tehran from what the British perceived as Soviet occupation. He ended up the primary negotiator for the Treaty of Friendship between Iran and the Soviets. The British helped him rise to prime minister in a 1921 coup, and eventually abdication by the king allowed him to consolidate power until he had himself named Shah in 1925. Reza Khan's rise ushered in the Pahlavi dynasty, most commonly associated with Iran's enigmatic 20th century. While he considered the new government a republic, many Iranis established especially the Mustahids, saw it as a thinly veiled dictatorship. In his words, he sought, and I quote, "a Persia free of clerical influence, nomadic uprising, and ethnic differences, European-style educational institutions, westernized women active outside the home, and modern economic structures with state factories, communication networks, investment banks, and department stores." In his eagerness to remove religiosity and tradition from Iranian culture, he even banned various forms of veiling for the women of Iran. The key here is the removal of choice. While the practice itself is controversial for many in the West, the notion of removing women's or communities' option, whether through his ban or the current regime's requirement, subverted people's rights. This also acted merely as a precursor for the more direct control. He went on to ban unions, political parties, and a free press. Indeed, not all Reza Khan directed should be seen negatively. He launched massive modernization programs, though one could debate whether modernization is even good. Industrialization, new infrastructure, modes of communication, and even the founding of the University of Tehran in 1934 outlined his vision. He also showed respect for religious minorities in Iran, such as Zoroastrian and Jewish communities. Reza remains a complicated figure in Iranian history, with both romantic and denigrating takes on his leadership. Most importantly, he impelled nationalism upon the Iranian people by undermining prior ideologies and their associated roles in constructing identity. Even his taken last name, Pahlavi, references a past Persian dialect aimed at appealing to a former glory. He also officially rebranded the nation for the West as Iran, or Land of the Aryans. Reza also attempted to renegotiate the oil concessions with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. During this process, he accepted money from the British to create a national bank of Iran, and this compromised his ability to really overhaul the accommodating terms, bankrupting Iran of its key resource. Growing weary of acting as a puppet for British interests and viewing Turkey's Mustafa Kemal Ataturk as a model for strong state builders, Reza reached out to competing European powers in attempts to diversify Iran's modernization projects. Germany appeared an ideal new partner. Leading up to World War II, trade with Germany comprised almost 50% of Iran's international market. Many Germans even lived in Iran. Needless to say, Reza's British proprietors saw this as a serious problem when the war broke out. When Reza refused to purge German citizens and cancel his contracts with their wartime enemy, England, with the help from the Soviet Union, formally occupied Iran and ousted him from power. He died in South Africa in 1944. The easing of Anglo-Soviet occupation and, importantly, serious questioning the civilized nature and ethics of European colonizers and their practices after they just spent the better part of 3 decades massacring each other in the millions prompted movements for change in Iran after the war. A new nationalism met with the creation of multiple political parties and a renewed attempt at a peaceful transition to an autonomous Iran. Ironically, a new imperial power that championed, quote-unquote, spreading democracy would destroy Iran's democratically elected representative republic, the U.S. This should come as no surprise to most who've studied foreign policy in the late 20th century. U.S. publicly stated noble intentions rarely correlated to actual intentions or were paralleled in actions. The ramifications of the incursion, as well as the resentment stemming from the prior events discussed, result in the well-known Islamic Revolution, which deserves its own lesson.